broad engagement with digital technology, social media, communal viewing practices, gender queerness, and current ethnic diversity contest the ubiquity of the politics of silence, to disrupt a master narrative that is static, heteronormative, and monoethnic in its approach to Blackness. So we're pleased to present to you Dr. Joan Morgan.
Thank you, Leah. Thank you, Dr. Reddick. Thank you for everyone who has come out for this event. I know, I don't know, we're all, we're a year into this pandemic. We're all a little Zoom weary and camera weary. And so I do not take it for granted that you guys are choosing to spend this time here. I'm so excited to get to the moderated part of the conversation, because that's always the most fun for me, is to hear how people are engaging the work. But I wanted to start, I know that we're going to talk about the strong Black woman, and I've had something to say about that for a very long time. And I think what is always both amazing to me and also saddens me is that when I wrote When Chicken Heads Come Home to Roost 20 years ago, it was really supposed to be my swan song on the topic. I figured that I would write this book explaining my relationship to hip hop and my relationship to feminism and how I thought they related to each other. And that all of these issues that were so burning and pressing for me as a young woman when I wrote the book, that I was trying to figure these things out in the process of writing the book, that 20 years later we would have resolved these things, and that these topics would no longer be interesting to people. And I was very wrong about that. And so one of the things that has been a resounding concern, and that one of the things that people really gravitate to in the book is my personal resignation from being a strong Black woman. It was, when I wrote the book, it was really heretical when I told people that that's like what I was writing about. No one resigns from being a strong Black woman. We wear that as a badge of honor. But I just needed to be really honest about the fact that when I wrote it, the last thing I was feeling was strong. I was actually falling apart a bit. And so I wanted to just take a moment to just read a little bit to you from the book so that you can get a kind of headspace for where I was. And I hope that anyone listening who is not really taking full account of the fact that we are in a global pandemic, we are in the midst of not just racial unrest, but racial reckoning in this country, that none of us should be feeling particularly invincible at this moment. If there's any time I think where you can feel good about putting down your strong Black woman armor for a minute, it should probably be now. But I just want to read to you a little bit so that you can hear where I was 20 years ago. And because this was so difficult a thing for me to say publicly, I could only do it by writing a letter, like an open letter to whoever would listen. And so this is how it started. To whom it may concern, for reasons of emotional health and overall sanity, I've retired from being a strong Black woman, all one word. Since I've been acting like an SBW for most of my life, I've taken the liberty of drafting a reorientation memo. To the white folks I work with, the fake fine and compulsory smile, gone, deaded, don't look for it. From now on, when asked, how are you? I'm gonna tell you the truth. So if you really don't give a shit, don't do yourself a favor and don't ask, because some days I really am an evil Black woman. To the folks in my life who are used to calling me at all hours of the AM and PM and repeatedly dumping their emotional refuse, please start looking for a therapist. I apologize for not telling you before that I'm not the strongest sister you know, that my shit is not always so damn together. Then again, you would know that had you interjected an occasional, hey girl, how you doing, in your tirades. There are days when my shit is downright raggedy. And on those days, I'm not feeling you. I've officially given myself permission to ignore all 20 of your messages, especially the ones telling me that you feel abandoned. To the brothers trying to kick it, stop. Let me save you some time. If my financial independence, education, ambition, looks, or basic determination to survive makes you question whether or not you have anything to give such a strong Black woman, don't bother. Return to the Valley of the Chicken Heads, because I don't fuck with that anymore. SBWs have needs, and I got plenty, and I'll gladly tell them to you while I'm running your bathwater, or you're rubbing me down with oil, or we're playing tag with our tongues. Bring it on if and only if you really believe you deserve me. And while I'm at it, mad love for my peeps who didn't need any of this, who knew I was never a strong Black woman, just fronting. Thanks for sticking around while I was tripping. Y'all know how shit goes. We get there in the by and by. Peace and love, Joan. Since sisters are quick to call themselves strong Black women and loath to call themselves feminists, I realize that my retirement requires some explanation. This is not to be confused with being strong, Black, and a woman. I'm still all of that. I draw strength daily from the history of struggle and survival that is a Black woman's spiritual legacy. What I have kicked to the curb was the years of social conditioning that told me it was my destiny to live my life as Black superwoman emeritus, that by the sole virtues of my race and gender, I was supposed to be the consummate professional, handle any life crisis, be the dependable rock for every soul who needed me, and yes, the classic, require less from my lovers than they did for me, because after all, I was a strong Black woman and they were, well, just endangered Black men. Retirement was ultimately an act of salvation. Being an SBW was killing me slowly, cutting off my air supply. And so, you know, we're all conditioned, very much trained by systems of racism and systems of patriarchy, that Black women's role is ultimately, at the end of the day, her role, her primary self caretaking is not taking care of self, but taking care of community, right? Taking care of children, taking care of elders, taking care of partners. And we are really cast in this role as the moral backbone of our race. And so many of us wear that as a badge of honor. And in some ways that really is, until you start to look at other statistics and say some things are not adding up. We over-index in heart disease. We over-index in HIV/AIDS. We over-index in now in the coronavirus. We over-index in the women who die inexplicably in childbirth. We over-index in all kinds of capacities of health, in part because the medical field has bought into this illusion that we are stronger. They don't pay attention when we say that we are in pain. They don't, how many of us even feel guilty for saying that something hurts? And part of the reason that we've developed guilt about it is because when we say something hurts, not even our doctors believe us, right? The people that we work for don't believe this. So we've sort of learned to go on automatic pilot. But still, 20 years ago and to some degree now, this was a phrase that Black women were particularly attached to. And I was suggesting very strongly that we get rid of it. So how do I do that? I had to start with really doing a deep dive into the history of the words. I believe that language has roots and antecedents, and many of the things that we will say and repeat, but we don't really know where they started and what their origins are. And a very, very long time ago, as an undergraduate, I was an African-American studies major. And I was shocked when I was digging through the works, being exposed to the works of like a Paula Giddings, who's a historian, a Michelle Wallace, who's a fantastic professor and cultural critic who wrote a book called Black Women and Black Macho and the Myth of the Superwoman. Ooh, I almost skipped that for a second, lost that for a second. Paula Giddings, Where and When I Enter. Where did this notion of Black women start as being stronger than anybody else? And so in my research, what I found out is that during American slavery in the US, Black women, the enslaved were really enslaved Black women were put outside of the category of women. The Victorian ideals that applied to white women, virtue and fragility and modesty, and that they needed to be protected. These are all very sexist premises, but sexism shows up differently for them, right, than it did for us. And so because we were not looked at as, we fell outside of the category of woman, none of that protectionist language applied to us. Even worse, our labor was needed. Our physical labor was needed in the fields. We were expected to work until we dropped, right? Our physical labor was needed in terms of sexual reproduction. We were seen as breeders, and so we were strong enough to take it. We were, and then on top of that sexual labor of physical strength, of being able to tolerate rape and sexual abuse, we were seen as being oversexed, that with this strength came these kind of animalistic, lascivious sexual urges, and that we couldn't be satisfied sexually, so that rape was not an issue, right? It was impossible to rape us. And we were strong enough to take whatever kind of sexual and physical abuse came at us. So we could work in the fields and in houses until we dropped. And what was expected was that we were strong enough to take it. Our children could be taken away from us shortly after nursing them, and we were expected to be strong enough to take it. And so the internalization of others' racism, frankly, and others' sexism, frankly, started to become endemic in our own language, in our own self-identity, how we started to think about ourselves and move through the world. And so that has just, you know, as we've gotten further and further away from being enslaved, the whiteness of that equation has sort of slipped away, and we've internalized it as a way that we need to move through our own community. And so I was thinking a lot about, wow, so 20 years later, we're still having this conversation. How is that showing up for me in 2021? So I read to you personally where I was. Like, at this point, I had a great job, or at least I had the job that I'd always wanted as a writer, as one of the first staff writers at Vibe. And I was literally at a Wu-Tang concert and a fight broke out, which you have to understand, like my 20s self, my 30s self, as a hip hop head, fights breaking out at a hip hop joint did not faze me like at all. I grew up in the South Bronx. I went to hip hop concerts, wearing my jeans, wearing my t-shirts, wearing my Timbs. And I understood that occasionally you might have to run. That the violence of the event didn't freak me out. What freaked me out is that I couldn't breathe. Like all of a sudden, it was like the walls were starting to literally close in on me. And so I thought I was just having a bad night. But then it started to be that I couldn't be in my house without having a window open. Being in a Manhattan elevator was like torture for me, being in a car without the window. And it started to exponentially get worse and exponentially get worse and exponentially get worse. But I couldn't bring myself to say that my job was wearing me out. I was exhausted. And so I had a very frank talk with my godmother, who's now deceased, who basically was like, you need to go, you love California. You need to just go figure out how you can be in the Bay for like 6 months or a year and get your head right, which was what I was able to do. And when I was away from my family, and I was still writing, but I wasn't in the office every day. I was sort of doing the California assignments and interviewing California rappers, blah, blah, blah. It gave me a chance to actually start to breathe fresh air again. And by fresh, I don't mean like dirt and pollution. I mean new, and start to reevaluate, why am I here? What is it that makes me happy? Why am I not taking the time to nurse a heart if it's broken? Why am I just moving right along in my relationships or anything else that's like handed to me like, I got this? And I realized that I had been very much, like most Black women, trained and conditioned to do that. So I wish I could say to you that this comes all wrapped up in a nice little bow, but the truth is that I'm a strong Black woman in recovery. I occasionally have to remind myself, oh, you're doing it again. You've taken on way too much. I do make a point, whether or not it makes people uncomfortable or not, to answer honestly. If you ask me how I am and I'm not having a good day, I tend to tell you that. I do not apologize for lack of productivity in what I think is one of the most difficult times historically that any living person has seen. I do not apologize for being in pain, because sometimes racism and sexism is just painful, and I have a really hard time functioning in it. And I try to make space for grief. I think that that's an important personal act, but I also think it's an important political act for Black women to be able to stand in our space and acknowledge our grief and say to the world, we have a right and we deserve to be able to feel that. And when we don't, crazy stuff starts to happen. So, I think like every Black person, not just in this country, but abroad, this moment of racial reckoning around George Floyd and Breonna Taylor was really powerful to witness and participate in and be a part of, right? At the same time, I don't know if you guys are remember Olatoyin's story. She was a young woman who came to participate in Black Lives Matter protests and was brutally sexually assaulted and then murdered. And I found ourselves even on the front lines with Black women marching side by side with Black men, queer and femme women marching side by side with Black men, that it was Black women once again who had to remind them, say her name. And even more so than say her name, say her murderer's name. Come up with a system of accountability for the Black men who hurt and maim and destroy us. Like you are asking us to show up for you over and over and over and over again in ways that you do not show up for us. And that is a really hard and difficult and painful thing to say. But if I'm refusing to be a strong Black woman, I am also saying to Black men, I need you to be a little stronger. I need you to step up. I need you to see that we don't get through this if we don't get through it together. I need you to imagine a world that if a Black woman is murdered while protesting and facing and calling out state-sanctioned violence, that she's putting her own body on the line, if she loses her life, there should not be resounding silence from Black men around that. In no world is that okay. And so, what does it mean? It doesn't just mean for us, for me as a Black woman, to say that I'm retiring from being a strong Black woman. It means that I need to be really conscious about my labor, my political labor, my spiritual labor, my love labor, my love language. Where are the places where I am showing up and I am not getting what I need in return? And so, I made a pretty controversial statement this summer. It's like, what would these marches look like if Black women just decided, we're not going? We're not going. We are not going until you show up for us in the ways that we show up for you, until you show some reciprocity, as Lauryn Hill has so eloquently expressed to us. And so we're still struggling with this notion of the strong Black woman. So these, its antecedents are very much steeped in American racism, but the ways that it continues to play itself out is in part our embrace of it as our own identity, but also because when we embrace it, it makes it really convenient for other people not to have to step up in really critical kinds of ways. And so that's been my exploration of being a strong Black woman. And so I want to really encourage people, and I hope we can talk about it. You guys will ask me questions, but I really want to encourage Black women at this time to be really mindful and check in with yourself, check in with your sister, check in and schedule timeouts for yourself. Really ask yourself, where am I today? How am I breathing? Does it hurt to get up and get through? And to really find a way to take the time for ourselves when we need to. And the reason that I say that I'm in recovery, like I just got my doctorate and defended last year. And it takes a lot to stand up, to your committee and say, I just can't, it takes a lot to stand up to your family and say, I can't be there in the way that I normally am and finish this dissertation simultaneously. And I need everybody to really back up off me for the next 6 months. It takes a lot. But when I didn't do it, my body always tells me when my strong Black woman thing is running amok, because eventually I'm sick in some way. Like I have a headache that I can't explain, or right now I'm in physical therapy because there's something weird happening with my shoulders or, and my hands, and I'm a writer. So when I physically can't be on a keyboard, that's saying to me, something is out of balance, something is out of whack. But I'm hoping that we can have these conversations in meaningful and substantial ways so that 20 years from now, that this concept of having to retire from being a strong Black woman is far more antiquated. And I'm really excited to have the moderated conversation, because I'm really interested in how being a strong Black woman shows up in your generation, in your practices. And I'm hoping I can offer some insight in how to break that cycle. Like I said, I don't think that you get up one day and you say, I'm no longer a strong Black woman, and it works and you're done and it's cured. That certainly has not been my experience. I really do believe it's sort of more like being in recovery. But I do believe that one of the biggest acts of strength that any of us can display is to admit when we are in distress. And, I'm Jamaican, so I'm just going to say it in Patois, can't take it on, right? And you have to give it to somebody else. So I'm going to pause there and I can go back, but I wanted to invite Leah and where's Joy? Yes, my other moderator. Sorry, these letters, even with the glasses, look really small on Zoom. And I wanted us to start a conversation, and we can kind of go back and forth between your questions and other stuff I have to say.
Okay, well, my first question from our list is, what is your definition of a hip hop feminist? What was it when you first wrote the book, and has it changed now that you're older and now that you've seen hip hop evolve into trap and different things? Has the definition stayed the same?
That is a genius question. It has absolutely changed. So let me explain to you, because I think this has kind of gotten lost in translation, because hip hop feminism has really become like a thing, right? But when I wrote the book, I wasn't really trying to make a thing. Like I wasn't trying to, I never conceived of hip hop feminism being taught in universities or people asking me to read their dissertations. Like I wasn't really, and I certainly wasn't academic. So none of that really was in my purview. What I was trying to do was answer a simple question. And that was, people kept stepping to me and saying, how can you consider yourself a feminist and love hip hop? And for me, as someone who loved hip hop long before they ever understood they could be a feminist, I didn't have like great language for it all the time, but I knew that it could exist because I existed. And I started to see, for me, it started to feel like the questions when people ask me, like, do you consider yourself Black, or do you consider yourself more Black, or do you consider yourself more woman? There's no dividing line in my body that says that from this part up, I'm Black, and from that part down, I'm a woman. They're integrated realities that can often be in conflict because of sexism and patriarchy, but that I daily have to figure out ways to work out those tensions, those polarities in those existence, the places where they chafe against each other, because I cannot choose one or the other. And at that time in my life, I felt the same way about feminism, which I really felt and feel is an important, potentially revolutionary, when done the right way, an absolutely critical body of knowledge for Black women to navigate these isms that are very real in our lives. Like I still feel that way. And I knew that hip hop put me in some really problematic places sometimes in terms of feminism. But I also knew that, again, I was as hip hop as I was a feminist, and I wasn't really trying to leave any of that behind. So then I had to articulate what were the parts of hip hop that made being a feminist difficult, and what was I scared of letting go, right? So what I was doing in hip hop feminism was, one, it's really more periodization than it is anything else. It's like the feminism that I felt came before me had really good things that I could pull from, but it didn't speak to my reality as being a young woman growing up in hip hop culture. And I needed to make space in feminist discourse for those of us who were growing up with hip hop as our reality, in many respects, our voice at the time period. I don't think now in 2021 that hip hop is the voice of the culture in the same way that I thought about it in 1999. I think a lot has changed, and the commercialization of the music is a strong force behind that. But certainly what I think of hip hop feminism, I think of the feminism that is being articulated by the members of the hip hop generation. And, it is malleable and changing, and I never expected it to stay the same. And I think that it's good. And I think that, to answer your question, I needed to put hip hop in front of my feminism, so I felt like I could make feminism work. I don't really feel that way anymore. Like, I don't get upset if anyone doesn't call me a hip hop feminist, but if you call me a feminist, I'm absolutely fine, because for me, I've sort of figured out where my relationship is as a Black woman with feminists, and to connect to a longer feminist history in a way that hip hop doesn't always have to be my point of entry. So, and I also I'm 55, I don't feel the same way about the music. I feel the same way about the music of my generation, but I don't feel the same way necessarily about the music of your generation. And I think that's fine, because when I was 24 and I first started writing about this music, certainly my parents did not feel about hip hop the way that I felt about hip hop. There's less distance between my son and I, actually, in terms of how we feel about hip hop, than there was between my parents and myself. But the unchanging identity for me actually is that I'm a feminist.
Thank you for that. Sorry, Joy. I was gonna say, we have a question in the chat. Did you ever have a conversation or talk to Miss Dolores Tucker? I know she was kind of against gangster rap music back in the 90s. Have you ever met with her or talked to her?
I never had the opportunity to talk to her. C. Dolores Tucker is a really interesting figure. I think that we probably would have butt heads around the issue of censorship. And this is broader for me than hip hop. I simply don't believe in the censorship of art. And I think that means that I necessarily, in taking that stance, expose myself to some things that I think are absolutely heinous. And then I have to remember, but you don't censor art, because I think that the conversation that emerges around it is far more valuable than the act of shutting it down. And so I think that for me, the road warrior work is really about engaging material that makes me anywhere from uncomfortable to sick, and having real conversations about origins, causes, what surrounded, where is this voice coming from, why is it shaped this way, and accountability, where I feel like if you just steamroll try to steamroll the records, what you do is that you make the people who make the music even more defensive about it, and you're not engaging in any kind of dialogue.
Okay, sorry, Joy, you can go.
No, I was just going to say there was a question in the chat as well, but we do have a hand raised by Dr. Reddick.
Just real quick, I mean, I have to say this because your book is an extension of what Anna Julia Cooper said, Paula Giddings said, Patricia Hill Collins, and that is that in the book, when you critique feminism and you talk about the ways that traditional feminism that's taught in academia doesn't speak to our existence, that's why your book was so important, because it continued this legacy of Black women saying that we have to define what that looks like for us. And the ways that it looks like for us has to include community, even while we're critiquing what that community looks like. So, you know, I'm telling you, this book, and I'm not a hip hop head, so I'm out of that generation. But your book and the way that you critique it, you know, helps me stay connected with, you know, the young people at the university, even though the music they listen to, I don't particularly care for, but it opens me up to that possibility. So I appreciate that you did that. I mean, you did so many things in that book, but that's one thing you did for me.
Thank you, Dr. Reddick. I think that, you know, one of the things that's changed a lot for me, Leah, going back to your other question, is it's very hard. You know, I'm a cultural critic, and I've been one for almost 30 years. It's really hard for me sometimes to read what passes as cultural criticism sometimes as articles, but also what also passes as cultural critique in like the Twitterverse. Because one of the things that I think I learned about being a cultural critic whose work is very much steeped in hip hop, but also in feminism, and ultimately, I think if you are a Black feminist, you are a Black feminist because you love Black people, right? So the critique for me always comes from a love space. I feel like who better to critique hip hop than those of us of the culture who love the culture and love it enough to hold it accountable. I'm always a little taken aback when I read Black cultural criticism now of film and music and art, and it comes from such a space of like, let me find the 5 things I can say on Twitter and tear it apart, boom. Because there's no love in that space, right? There's absolutely no love in that space. There's no asking for, this is what I see, this is what I might have missed, what was it that you were trying to do, and how do we make this better? There's also no room to just disagree. It's really okay. Some things I just don't particularly like. It doesn't mean that I need to do a cultural critique of it. It just means I don't like it. And it's not worth me like stirring up like 2 hours of conversation on Twitter back and forth with people. So I think that part of, people ask me, why has this book endured? And I think it's because it's really written from a space of love. And I am really clear about my love, particularly not just for hip hop, but for the complicated ways it expresses Black men's voices. And what I have learned from becoming a scholar of Black feminist ideologies, the one thing that like Black feminism is clear about is that we leave no one behind. Like, we just are not leaving anyone behind. And if you're not leaving anyone behind, there has to be a calling in, and there has to be some systems of accountability put in place. But no one is called out and put out and left out, and then you think the work is done and you keep moving. It's just not the way that Black feminism works. So yeah, it's been really interesting to see. I ask myself now, would I make a good music critic or hip hop critic? And I struggle with that because I just don't know that the climate allows for the way that we particularly used to approach critique.
Thank you. Thank you. I do have another question for you. While responding to a question on President Kennedy's assassination, Malcolm X said it was a matter of chickens coming home to roost.
Mm-hmm.
This phrase typically means that bad things have happened in the past, and those same things are now coming back to haunt that person. Why did you choose that title for your first book?
Oh, when the chicken heads come home to roost. Because I felt that the way that we dealt with the subject of the chicken head, right? Many of us as Black women, it was really anything from disparaging to hypocritical, and that she was sort of left out of and considered undeserving of the same sort of like feminist space and analysis that we would give strong Black woman who we would like embrace, right? So what I wanted to do was, the last chapter of the book, which is like one of my favorites, really points out the ways that we can be really critical of certain Black women and not identify the ways that we actually sometimes exhibit the same behavior. And if we're not exhibiting the same behavior, then there might actually be a jealousy that's coming about that we haven't expressed, but that we're sort of standing on a moral high ground, as opposed to going, I don't know, I'd kind of like to not, I don't know, like, yeah, she's using what she's got to like establish the kind of life that she wants, but I'm busting my ass over here at like 3 jobs. And so, does it really look all that bad to me over there? Or should I just say that it looks that bad? So I wanted to find a way to lovingly kind of say, if we don't have these difficult conversations in-house amongst Black women, and kind of lay it on the table, like, yeah, I'm saying that I hate you, but do I really hate you? Or am I like a little jealous of like the way that you get to navigate the world, and I've chosen to navigate it a different way, and it's just much harder. And so that to me was it. It was that if we don't have really honest conversations, the whole thing kind of blows up. So that's why I called it When Chicken Heads Comes Home to Roost. And it was a direct play on the chickens coming home to roost, about the lack of acknowledgement of racism.
Thank you so much. I did have a question about one term from your book, the endangered Black man. So how do you define that? And what I also did, and you told me that you had a son, how has it been navigating raising a son in this climate and knowing that Black men are endangered?
So when I wrote When Chicken Heads Come Home to Roost, I wasn't really thinking about the literal physical danger of state-sanctioned violence in the police, which is now, when we think endangered Black men, we literally think of Black men with a target on their back, right? So my headspace wasn't there 20 years ago, which tells you something, because when I was thinking about Black men, I wasn't thinking about them as being moving targets. So this shows you that there has been a steady escalation in the kind of violence that we've seen against Black men and Black male bodies. Now, did Black men have stories of, being college students and being pulled off to the side to the police? Absolutely. But we're in a digital age where where the escalation of violence against Black male bodies, unpunished state-sanctioned violence, also circulates now in a way where when we think of endangered Black men, we are really thinking about their physicality. When I wrote When Chicken Heads Come Home to Roost, and I was thinking about endangered Black men, I was thinking about their emotionality. I was thinking about the fact that many Black women raise their daughters, right, to use a Marita Golden term, raise their daughters and spoil their sons, right? And so I'm also Jamaican, and so that way that plays itself out in Caribbean households is tangible, right? Like, and I was probably pretty lucky. It wasn't as bad in my household as I've seen it in others. But you know, the boys are raised as, you know, they're valuable in a particular kind of way, right? And we can be kind of protectionists of Black men because we've been raised to feel that they're up against so much. And so I found myself that while politically that might be an okay stance to take, that when we started to move into like the dynamic of like cisgendered love relationships, it's a hot, holy mess, right? Because somebody who identifies themselves as endangered and you identify yourself as strong also sees you as strong, right? So all the things that they're saying that they are up against, racism, basically racism, right? But all forms of different kind of racism. The idea is that you are a woman, a Black woman, and somehow racism doesn't affect you as badly, right? So somehow you are stronger and you are able to manifest those symptoms with different outcomes. And on top of that, you're expected to make excuses because of racism for, frankly, just Black men not showing up. So what I was writing about in Chicken Heads is that this equation of like endangered Black men and strong Black women trying to get together and have relationships is just a recipe for disaster in many ways, because what you have are two sets of entities that are not really privileging becoming their best selves, and falling into the expectations, really, that racism actually kind of sets for us. And really by expectations, I mean traps. So yeah, I think, you know, one of the things I say in Chicken Heads that you can love an endangered Black man, you can care about an endangered Black man, how much you actually respect an endangered Black man as a woman is a whole other question. And until we start to be really honest about that, like, you know, do I really respect you for handling your business and being there for me and showing up? That's really hard expectation to have of someone who you accept as endangered.
That's a good point right there. And I would definitely hold on to that. I want to encourage everyone to, if you have a question, feel free to drop it in the chat. Go ahead and use the raise hand feature. We would love to get those questions in that you all may have. I do have another question though. You explore your struggle with feminism, particularly the way that it was espoused in the university classrooms. They were down for the liberation of women as long as it didn't infringe on their sense of entitlement, and it allowed them to share their power to oppress. But over 20 years later, is this still the case in today's university classrooms?
I think the university classroom, okay, so you're asking me from two really different parts of my life, right? Like when I wrote Chicken Heads, I went to college and was like, I will never set foot in another academic institution ever again. Like, I'm done. You know, I wasn't a terrible student by any stretch of the imagination. I went to Wesleyan, but I was by no means did anyone in my family think that I was gonna be magna cum laude or summa cum laude. I just wanted my degree and like to kind of be out, right? And I was at Wesleyan. I was fortunate enough to have a brilliant Black feminist thinker as a professor, Hazel Carby. And I didn't even realize then the privilege of being able to say, wow, I sat in Hazel Carby's classroom. But she opened up the world for me through fiction. I probably wouldn't be a feminist today if I hadn't taken Black women in their fictions, because I was able to understand the other feminism, women's studies classes I had tried to take, I felt like they didn't have anything to do with me. I mean, to be real honest about it, I was still living in the South Bronx when I went to Wesleyan. I was like, I may have gone to private school, but I had only spent 4 years in private school. And so the whole world of like Simone de Beauvoir and white feminists, just the approach of white feminism. Like, you know, I remember like my first day, a friend of mine we were on campus and asking for, Allison said, could you show me the ladies' room? And they like very snidely said to her, it's the women's room and it's with a Y. And I was like, who the fuck are these bitches? Like, that was really my attitude back then. So, you know, there was no space for who I felt I was, not just as a Black woman, but as a Black Caribbean woman. And actually the process of signing on to feminism was understanding that my strongest feminist role models are really not in academia. Like, they're honestly the women that I came up with. Like, my mother would call herself a feminist now, but that's because of me, you know? But she's absolutely my first role model for what feminism looks like. And that feminism predates this kind of 1960s idea of like bra burning. Like, I just feel like Black women were sold a bill of goods on feminism for a long time. And then, you know, the true Black feminist genealogies, I felt there's so many women who didn't go to colleges or the kind of college that I went to were never exposed to it, which is really why I wrote Chicken Heads, was because I was trying to balance the equation a little bit. And I have to be really like, keep it 100, like, Black feminists were not loving Chicken Heads when it came out. Like, I thought I was gonna write this book and be invited to like sit at the table with my sister scholars and my heroes, and they ignored me for a good 10 years. This book exists in academia because there were students who loved it and brought it to their professors and said, why aren't we reading this? The same, you know, I am very capable, even at, you know, even with my undergraduate education, I know how to speak academese, right? So Chicken Heads could have sounded a different way, but I'm a writer. And in terms of craft, that book is deliberately written that if you really like it, you can read it in 2.5 days, 2.5. You'll just sit and cuddle up with it. And it's written that way. If you don't like it, it might take you 2 weeks, but I definitely did not want language to be a barrier in terms of the information. And quite frankly, a lot of the feminist texts I read were really academic, and there wasn't, it's not that there was anything wrong about that. I just wanted the work to live outside of the ivory tower. But it was not an immediate embrace of this book by any stretch of the imagination. It was actually, in some cases, the rejection was quite brutal. And it was actually students and many Black male professors who brought the book in and embraced it. And it took about 10 years, honestly, before it really became kind of a staple, I would say, in the canon. And part of it too was because I was writing a book and I didn't have a master's or a PhD. And so there was a little bit of that kind of snobbery around it, like, did it belong in the canon? And I was a journalist, so, you know, I actually write shit with the expectation that people can understand it and read it. So there was that. And so I always say that the blessing was that I didn't write Chicken Heads as a graduate student in a doctoral program, because all of the things I think that make that book valuable, its language, its rhythm, the fact that I wanted somebody who was from a background like me, working class from the South Bronx, who could hear herself in it and say, okay, maybe there's a space in all of this for me. They would have beaten all of that out of me in grad school. I would have been told at every single turn that I could not write this book this way. Even my dissertation was a struggle, and sometimes because, you know, I love my committee like nobody's business. I actually have an entire committee of color and of feminists. However, I was really determined that I was going to write this book. And at some places, although it's full of academic language, I had to sound like me. And the reason that I had to sound like me is because I need the young woman who is struggling to think, is there a place for me? Can I do a PhD? I need her to like see the places where I talk just like my South Bronx self, or I speak just like my Jamaican self. I am not, the language, I don't need 6-syllable words to say what I could say in straight talk. I need her to read that and go, yes, I can do it because she did it. She's telling me right here that there's a space for me. And that actually is like, if I can't do that, then the PhD doesn't really mean that much to me.
Okay, I think this is my last question focused on Black men, but I did want to ask, and if you don't have an answer, that's fine, because it's not your responsibility to know this question, to know the answer, but what do you think are the first steps Black men can take to holding themselves accountable? Because I know for the Black men in my life, it starts with just admitting that there's a problem, and that's hard to get to, but some of them do. So then what are the first steps into holding themselves accountable and mentally nurturing themselves, being there for themselves emotionally and trying to become more emotionally intelligent?
So I think that that's a broad group, right? So it depends on a lot of things, right? I think, is this a person that has access to therapy? I think that we minimize in our community how absolutely important therapy is, because so many of us are living with trauma, so many of us are living with unacknowledged, untreated trauma. So I think therapy is really important. I also think for those Black men who are readers and seem to be really well versed in like 50 million Black male books, Black women have written a lot of shit. You should read it. You should read it. You should organize amongst yourselves. You should have discussions. Like, we've actually done a lot of the labor that you need to begin to change it up and walk a different path. But I think none of that can really happen unless there is a real place to deal with that trauma. And I think that the same is the same is true for Black women. I think that couch time is good for all of us. We're walking around with untreated trauma, many of us, every single day. And many of us don't even really know that we're still carrying it until something triggers us and it just becomes painfully evident that the work that I thought I did, I haven't quite finished, or I may never finish, but these are the things that I need to do to keep working on it. So that's what I would say. And I would, I think another really painful conversation that we have to have, and Black men have to have amongst themselves, is how wedded am I to patriarchy? Like, how much of how I define my manhood is by what I think white men have and I don't have, and I think that I should have it, which includes the power to oppress other people. I think that that's a really difficult conversation that requires some soul searching, and that we don't phrase that question that way and often enough to Black men. But you have to own that. You really have to own that. Yeah, I mean, I kind of felt that every time I saw a Black man sit down with Trump. I just was like, wow, it really means a lot to you to be sitting in that house, in the company of what you think is the president of the United States. Like, I think that I think we see it pop up and manifest in very different ways, but much of what we see is really, we define masculinity by power, and we shape power in very specific ways in a US context, right? Part of that is the power to oppress. And at the top of that pinnacle are white men. So if your notion of equality is to be able to do the same as your oppressor does, that makes your relationship to me as a Black woman, or to Black femmes, or to Black queers, really precarious, because we are going to be the group that you are going to be able to oppress, if that's the power you're asking for.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. We do have a hand raised by Yasmin. Go ahead.
Hi. Um, my question is, I recently have been reading this book called Hood Feminism by Mickey Kendall.
Mhm.
And it kind of, are you familiar with this book? You probably are. You read more than me, I'm sure. But yeah, it basically goes into how the feminist movement isn't really, it never really included Black women. And so my question for you is how you came to accept yourself as a feminist and then call your movement or your project the hip hop feminist without feeling, I don't know, with feeling like empowered as a Black woman feminist.
So, I think I think I felt that way for a long time, that feminism didn't really have anything to do with me as a Black woman. But I also think that feminism has a very broad history that's not just centered in the United States, right? That white women do not own the history of feminism, right? And I realized that if I made a statement like feminism doesn't have anything to do with me because I'm a Black woman, then I have to cut off too much. I have to cut off Sojourner Truth. I have to cut off my connection to Ida B. Wells. I have to cut off my connection to Anna Julia Cooper. I have to cut off the name of the nameless Black woman who was standing there, at the height of the Haitian Revolution when the Abeng was blown. Like, there's just too many. Like, our history of feminist action, take the F word away and just look at the actions of it, go back for hundreds of years. Like, I'm Jamaican. I can't think of a more feminist woman than Nanny of the Maroons, who is literally the national hero of my country. And so to ask me to make a statement that like feminism is for white women means that I historically disconnect myself from all of the badass women that came before me. And I simply just cannot do that because that is my history to claim. And so in calling myself a feminist, because I tried out different things, I was like womanist, Africana feminist, blah, blah, blah. I just felt like at the end of the day, it was all semantics. I know a feminist when I see one. I know her whether she calls herself feminist or not. And I know where we can link to do the work. And so for me, what I called myself became less important, but I chose feminism to make space for the women who were like me and questioning whether or not there was a space in this ideology for us. And then, like I said, hip hop feminism was really me trying to figure out how to answer a question that kept coming up. And I honestly wrote the book and thought, okay, that's the answer. And I don't have to talk about it anymore. So the idea that it went on to become a lasting kind of thing, and that, you have crunk feminism and trap feminism and hood feminism and ratchet feminism. I think all of those things are really beautiful expressions and attempts at people doing what I talk about in Chicken Heads, was like each generation, feminism is a bolt of cloth. It's just a bolt of cloth. And each generation has to cut it and fashion it and style it in a way that fits and makes the most sense to them. And hip hop feminism was just, for me, what made the most sense. But it doesn't negate any of the other Black women feminisms that are out there. And I think that it, if anything, it should encourage us to say that feminism belongs to all women who need it, right? And for Black women, because of our specific histories, it needs to look and feel a certain kind of way. And we can make it look and feel a certain kind of way.
We do have a question in the chat. Angelica has asked, have you ever considered filmmaking or TV creating?
Where's Angelica?
Mm.
Yes, I have. I am actually doing two things right now. I've always wanted to be a screenwriter. Like, that was, if I thought I was going to be any kind of writer, I never thought I was going to be a journalist. And there's a whole long story about in the book how I am the most accidental journalist that you could possibly find. Like, I've never even taken a writing class, but I always knew that I wanted to tell. I originally thought I was going to be an actor, and I always knew that I wanted to tell Black women's stories on screen. And so, in a very full circle kind of way, while I was doing my PhD, my book was optioned for screenwriting, my first book, When Chicken Heads Comes Home to Roost. And so the producers are giving me first crack at writing the script, which is extremely exciting. And I'm actually working with my son, who is a film and what am I paying all that tuition for? Television production and screenwriting major at Chapman. So he's my creative partner in that. And I'm actually writing the treatment for a pilot with another friend of mine from high school right now. So right now, the writing that I'm doing is actually screenwriting. So that was very astute. Absolutely. Oh, and I've been doing some songwriting. So.
I have a question. What advice would you give to young Black women like myself, really just trying to focus on themselves and not focusing on the other things in life, like the BS of life, like just really staying true to who you are and not getting distracted by all the outside things?
So we talked about therapy. But I think, I think for me, and I don't know that if this works for everyone else, but the thing that keeps me accountable is my village. I've had my oldest girlfriends, I want to say I've been friends with them since I was like 13 years old. So we're like 40 years deep into a friendship. Some of us have had our children at the same time. Now they're our children, basically our family. They call each other cousins. I think the way that you stay sane, or I have stayed sane as a Black woman, is being really conscientious about how I build village. And how I build village is very much linked to my feminism, because I think that feminism is a noun, but it's really a verb. It's how we show up for other Black women, how we make space for other Black women, how we hold each other. And I say that, but my sister circle is actually a little more multiracial than that, but it is so deeply linked to my praxis as a Black feminist that I have people at 3:00 in the morning if I'm just wilding out, and or I'll give you an example. My son had COVID. And because I'm a New Yorker and we went through that horrible, horrific 100 days, COVID hits me in a different way than it hits it hit a lot of people at that time, because literally I live in the neighborhood that was under siege from both the police and the riots. Like I could hear the helicopters 8:00 every night. And we had bodies literally rotting in trucks around the city. So my biggest fear was that he was going to get COVID and I wouldn't be there to help him protect him. So when I heard he had COVID, and now mind you, this kid had COVID in the best possible way. Like he was tired one day, he was put up in a hotel for like 10 days and isolated and basically just chilled, right? But I couldn't function when he called me. I literally fell out on the floor here in the living room, called the aunties and was like, you had no uncles. I was like, you have to take over. They're like, what do you need us to do? I was like, call him, come up with a plan. Somebody text me, I'm out. Like, I just cannot function. Like I need a good 24 hours to like, just realize like, okay, this has been my worst fear that's been realized. But you only are able to do that because I built the foundation for that really early. Something inside me, even as a young woman, knew that I needed very long and deep and meaningful friendships. And the way that you get to that is that people ask me, how are you friends with people for like, people say, oh, we've been friends a long time. We've been friends for 3 years. And I'm like, what? Like, I don't even understand that. But part of it is understanding that people make mistakes and people are not disposable. And so that when you put your stakes in friendships like that, you are going to have trials and tribulations, and people are going to make you upset, and you're going to make people upset, and y'all are going to fall out, and then you'll get back together. But the core of the bond has to be that we don't let each other go. And I've just been really fortunate to have people in my life. My oldest friend is Dr. Mark Anthony Neal from Duke. We've been friends since we were 3. We went to Head Start together. Like, in some ways, he knows me better than I know myself. And at times where I think like I'm perfectly fine, I have people in my life who'll be like, you are not fine. You are wilding out. You need a timeout. So I think that part of that is just building your circle, you know, and really understanding, Joy, that none of us can move in isolation, and that we have to find the people that we trust, and we have to be willing to grow together. I think that many Black women struggle with loneliness. The pandemic has like heightened that in reality in many ways for people. But I think that being unpartnered is one thing, and being alone is another. And so if you really develop those kind of relationships, you will find that there's always love in your life, right? There's always a place where you know that you can show up and know that you are truly, truly, truly loved. And I weave that through my entire life. I don't work in spaces where I don't feel loved. I adore my boss. I will tell anyone who listens how much I love Deborah Willis. I sing her praises all the time because when I was at Essence, I loved the staff. When I was executive editor at Essence, I love the mission for what we're doing. I just do not put myself in spaces where I cannot be fully loving or loved, because I'm not good at biting my tongue, and I'm not good at suffering in silence. And so I need to create spaces and realities where I'm functioning in love, at least most of the time, if not all of the time, most of the time. And so, yeah, I think you do that, you check in, you be really honest with yourself when your strong Black woman thing is kicking in, and get off social media. To truly jump off your Insta, get off Twitter. Like, you would really be amazed how much healthier you can feel when you put yourself on a social media diet, and you're not being bombarded with constant information and comparisons to other people's lives and their stuff. Like, I give myself permission to check out all the time. I don't think I've been on I don't even know if my Facebook account still exists, honestly, because I'm only ever jump on it if I have something to promote. And the last time I did was 2018. So it's just sitting there. And I find taking real social media, digital space breaks does a lot for my just overall well-being and self-worth.
Okay, I apologize in advance. This question's a little long, but when the song WAP came out by Cardi B and Megan Thee Stallion, a lot of men and fathers were upset that this was negatively influencing their daughters, even though it kind of our male rap negatively influences them too, if that's what negative means to them, whatever. They were upset that their daughters could hear this and they thought it would negatively impact their daughters. Personally, I don't see young women hearing about pleasure and sexuality it being a bad thing, especially since there's so much shame around our sexuality. But that's my personal opinion. How do you feel about it as someone that's older and you've seen the effects of our how our sexuality has been affected through hip hop and through music and us expressing ourselves? Do you think that songs like WAP are a negative thing in the long run, or is it in fact empowering for young women to hear? And there's no right or wrong answer. I don't want you to feel uncomfortable answering it. I just want to see how you feel.
I'm so not uncomfortable. I mean, I wrote a whole dissertation on the politics of pleasure and the need for Black women to disengage the discussions of our sexuality and our pleasure solely from trauma, right? So they can't all start in the space of hypersexuality if we don't even have language for sexuality, right? So for me, Cardi and Megan are what I have been arguing for a really long time. So I love the song, but I think that my even greater than, when I say I love the song, I love everything about it. I love that they are clear about their pleasure, that they're advocating for their pleasure, that they know what makes them feel good, that they're unapologetic about it. But aesthetically, I love the song. I love seeing Cardi next to Meg. I love Meg's body, her stature, then the contrast of Cardi's and the way that they're playing with each other and the eroticism. Like, I think it's great. But do you know what I love most about it? Was jumping on Instagram and seeing a post from my son, which goes back to, how do you raise a feminist son and all this, and seeing a post from him that's like quoting all of these like just dumb, sexual lyrics from male rappers about what they want women to do, and him going, and you never had a problem with this. And a woman talks about what makes her feel good, and all of y'all like losing your mind. You're full of shit. You need to like check your pleasure politics. And I was like, okay, Mom, your job here is done. You raised a good son. And I never even made a post about WAP, because I was like, okay, I'll just repost you, because that's it, like right there in a nutshell. So I think that part of the response that you're talking about is coming from men who were not taught that women should have any voice in expressing their pleasure, right? And that also means, like, if we have no voice in expressing our pleasure, any old bullshit that you show up with, we're supposed to be grateful for, right? So it's really destabilizing and challenging to like an ego that says that what I'm doing should please you and you should have no voice and agency in that. So it really didn't surprise me. I was actually quite tickled to see them all bent out of shape about it, because I also think, like, it's not just about your daughter. That's giving you something to really think about. Like, was she really enjoying that last time with you? Or like, was she fronting like she enjoyed that last time with you? But that's what I think has to happen. Like, I think that we've been forced to deal with the most puerile and infantile expressions of Black male sexuality in hip hop. I think that, like, us advocating for what makes us feel good and being unapologetic about it really should not be something that is even challenged. Like, of course that was a hit. It should have been a hit. It's a great song, but it also says to women, you have a right to feel good, and you have a right to demand that you're made to be feel good. And I just think that's really important.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that.
Does anyone else have any other questions that they want to, go ahead and ask? Feel free to do so.
I have a question. Hi, Dr. Morgan. So I'm super excited. So I'm quoting some of your work in an article that I'm writing. I'm writing an article about a Black girl navigating the K-12 system through hip hop and other mothers. And so I'm just excited about your work. But you said something key earlier, that you took a year off from work. And I wanted to know, what was that like? How did you process that information, and what did you do in all the steps while you were off away for the year? What things did you work on mainly?
I took a year off from work. I'm trying to remember the context.
I think she means when you went to California. Is that what you mean?
Oh, yeah. So, I've never been wealthy enough to not work. I took 6 months off when I had my son. And so that I was really lucky to be able to do that and have a partner where we could kind of, afford to do that for like 6 months. But when I went to California, what I won, I was still working, but I wasn't in Vibe's office, which means, and I wasn't in New York, so I wasn't in the belly of hip hop culture in that way. And even though I was still doing LA-based stories, I would fly into LA and then come back to the Bay, which is just geographically, it's just a very different environment. I was surrounded by water, I was surrounded by hills, I was surrounded by very different type of energy. And because I really didn't know that many people in the city, and I still do this, honestly, like if I'm going to go write, I tend to go to a city where I only know like 1 or 2 people, because it forces me to just spend a lot of time with the thoughts in my head. I spent a lot of time just walking around San Francisco, just walking and walking and walking and walking, deliberately getting lost, finding my way back. And what I really was just trying to do was create clear space again to hear myself, myself think. And I think the line in the book is, you know, I went by the water and I could hear Oshun's laughter twinkling like bells. I could hear the laughter, the magic of a Black girl's laughter. And that's really what I wanted, was to be able once again to remember who I was when I wasn't on the treadmill trying to do things all the time. And it's the same reason that I jump off like social media without, you know, I love the people who like jump off social media and they make a big production about the fact that they're jumping off social media. Like I just jump off. Like I don't tell people I'm going, you know, I'm just out and then I come back. And I think that it's really important to clear space in that way. The other lesson that I've held on to from that moment, I say no a lot. Part of that is a function of being 55. I just don't really do things unless I really, really, there had to be like 3 reallys in there. Like I gotta really, really, really wanna do it in order to do it. And I think as Black women in particular, especially in terms of our career, that we just say yes to too much stuff, right? We say yes because we can't think of an excuse at the moment to say no. So we don't have a scheduling conflict. You know, it's an extra check. We can't find enough no's, so we say yes. And I just realized that in order to really be a creative, Angelica, this goes back to you, particularly with screenwriting, I had to create enough space for characters to show up and start to talk to me. And they couldn't do that when I was just overscheduling myself all the time. And I think in the pandemic, we're all really susceptible to that, like filling our days with constant Zooms. But I really need blocks and blocks of unapologetic, I have nothing scheduling to do. What are you doing? Nothing. Because in that nothing, that's the space that I start to create in. That's where I start to explore new ideas. And I think that it's just really important for us to try to create that space. Now, it wasn't possible when I was working on a dissertation forever, because as soon as, you know, I cleared space, the dissertation was like right there. But that was one of the biggest surprises of getting the dissertation finally off my plate, was, wow, there's just so much extra space up here now to think and create. So I think time is one of our most valuable resources, you know, like that treasure Maxine Waters says, reclaim your time. Really be deeply protective of your time.
Did anyone else have any questions for Dr. Joan Morgan?
Well, if there are no other questions for the evening, we'd like to, thank you, Dr. Morgan, for spending this evening with us. This was amazing. I'm so thankful that made this suggestion to bring you here. It's been an amazing night with you. As you all know, the African American Peer Mentoring Program was helpful in putting this together. And so we need some feedback. We want to make sure that we're bringing speakers that are here that are changing your lives for Black students, to improve Black student success and Black faculty and staff success at our institution. So there's a survey that we have dropped in the chat box. If you will please do me a favor and fill out that survey, we would greatly appreciate that. And we just want to thank you for coming. We will have some more events. Tomorrow we do have Tamika D. Mallory coming. And next week we have Kat Rodriguez coming, who was the saxophonist for Beyonce for 10 years. And the week after that, we will have Nikki Giovanni coming. And we have some more exciting speakers, just like Dr. Morgan that was here tonight. And we just want to say, once again, thank you all for coming out.
This is great. Thank you. It's wonderful spending time with you.
And thank you.
You were
on social media, Dr. Morgan.
Thank you. You guys had great questions.
You were so dope. And thank you to Joy and Leah. You guys were awesome.
Yes, Joy and Leah, you did a great job. They really were great questions. They really were.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for having us.
Truly.
Thank you for your joy. I apologize. I missed that. You get a little nervous when you get talking. So thank you again. And thank you, Dr. Green, for your hard work.
Appreciate it. Really appreciate it.
Thank
Have a
you.
beautiful
Thank
night,
you for
dear
making this
eyes.
happen. Bye. Good night, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Back again.